The wind howled across Clayton's ridge as a widow in black was offered like livestock, traded for 30 acres of flood-prone land. Her son gripped her hand, silent as stone. One man stepped forward and claimed them both. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wagon creaked as it pulled away from the ridge, the wheels slicing silent tracks into the snow-packed road. Evelyn sat stiff-backed beside a man she hadn't met until an hour ago. Her gloved hands wound tightly in her lap like they were holding something in. A scream, perhaps, or the last threads of her pride. Her coat, too thin for the season, clung to her shoulders with the same quiet desperation she wore on her face. Her son, Samuel, huddled beside her under a wool blanket that smelled faintly of horses and hay, but she welcomed it. Anything to shield the boy from what had just transpired. Ezekiel didn't speak as he drove. His face was the kind that had long forgotten how to soften. His jaw remained set, not in anger but in resignation, as though life had taken the sharpest parts of him and sanded them dull. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He was simply surviving, and she had just become another transaction in that survival. Snowflakes clung to his coat collar and melted in his beard. The reins twitched slightly in his calloused hands, but the horses obeyed without resistance, used to long silences and harder burdens. Behind them, Dry Hollow shrank into a haze of chimney smoke and unspoken judgment. Evelyn didn't look back. What was there to look at? A crowd of men with winter breath and summer cruelty, a mayor who spoke of her as if she were no more than acreage, and no one who said a word in protest. She had learned a long time ago that women like her were measured not by their worth, but by what they could be traded for. Today she had fetched a plot of land with poor fencing and flood-prone soil. 30 acres for a woman and a child. Less than a penny an acre, if you asked the right man. But Evelyn hadn't asked. She had simply shown up, because there was nowhere else to go. Samuel shifted against her, his cheek pressing to her arm, and for a moment, she dared to breathe. Her fingers reached beneath the blanket and found his. Small, tense, but warm. He didn't speak. He hadn't in months. But he let her hold his hand, and that, for now, was enough to anchor her. As they neared a stand of bare cottonwoods, the sky blushed with the last light of day. It painted Ezekiel's weathered face in soft gold, and Evelyn studied him with quiet calculation. This man had not bought her with love, nor had she offered it. But somewhere between the silence and the snow, something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, but the beginning of an understanding. An arrangement born not of affection, but of necessity. And necessity, Evelyn knew, was sometimes the only soil where something true could grow. The cabin had always been a house of silence, but now it carried a new kind of quiet, the kind that listened. Not the emptiness of loneliness, but the hush of two lives circling one another without collision. Evelyn moved through the space like she had always belonged to it, yet never claimed it. Her footsteps were soft, even on the warped floorboards. Her voice, when she used it, was low and level, as though careful not to startle the air itself. And still, the place responded to her. Meals appeared on the table without fanfare. The woodpile grew without being asked, and the creaking cupboard doors no longer groaned in protest after she'd oiled their hinges one morning before dawn. She asked for nothing. Not a bed to herself, not a drawer in the pine chest, not even a say in what was planted come spring. She slept with Samuel under a quilt on the narrow cot tucked against the fireplace, her body curled protectively around him as if the world still threatened to take what little she had left. Ezekiel sometimes watched from the shadows of the stairwell, not out of desire, but out of a strange ache. An ache for something not quite tenderness and not quite regret. He had never seen a woman labor like her, not with bitterness or martyrdom, but with the sheer gravity of someone who could not afford collapse. Her hands bore the proof: a dozen healing cuts along her knuckles, a small scar by the base of her thumb, a dark burn along her wrist from where the stove spit without warning. She never complained. Instead, she moved from task to task with the single-mindedness of someone repairing more than just broken hinges or torn hems. She was stitching the fabric of herself back together, and Ezekiel, though he wouldn't admit it aloud, was beginning to feel like a seam in that fabric. Samuel trailed her like a shadow with weight. He never cried, not even in sleep. Sometimes he'd sit at the edge of the porch steps, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes watching the cattle with a far-off look that didn't belong to a boy of 6. Once, Ezekiel caught him pressing his ear to a mare's flank, just listening to the rhythm of her breathing like it was a lullaby he could almost remember. Ezekiel didn't understand the boy's silence, but he began to listen for it anyway. And then there was the humming. Evelyn's voice would drift softly through the cabin at night, thin as smoke and just as elusive. It wasn't always a melody. Sometimes it was more like a thread of memory, knotted with longing. He never asked what it meant. Some things, he figured, shouldn't be unpacked. They should just be left to play out in the dark, like the hush of snow falling outside the window. He didn't know how to name what she stirred in him. Not love, not yet, but something old and sacred, like the reverence a man holds for the land when he realizes it still grows life, even after the frost. The wind outside had softened, brushing the eaves like a whisper too shy to speak aloud. Inside, the cabin was still, the kind of stillness that follows something sacred. Ezekiel sat at the edge of his bed, the quilt draped over his knees like a revelation. It was heavier than it looked, each stitch holding more than thread, memory, effort, grace. He ran his fingers across the fabric slowly, reverently, pausing at each corner as if turning pages in a book meant just for him. The calf, stitched in warm browns, reminded him of the one they lost to frost 2 winters back. The handprint, Samuel's, unmistakably, was pressed in navy thread like a promise that small hands could still claim something. And the book spine, delicately embroidered in gray, bore 3 words that struck deeper than any sermon. Psalm 23. He could feel their echo even now. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Ezekiel wasn't a man given to symbols, but this wasn't decoration. This was a map. A quiet chart of who he'd become and who'd helped him get there without ever asking for thanks. He stared at the quilt until the colors blurred, then blinked hard. That's when he noticed Evelyn at the doorway. Her fingers curled around the frame like she wasn't sure if she should come in. "I thought," she said, barely louder than a creaking board, "if you ever felt alone again, you'd at least have something that remembered you." It was the kind of sentence that didn't land in the ears, but in the ribs. He turned to speak, to say something of the weight of her kindness or the way she'd stitched her soul into that quilt. But the words caught in his throat. And then came the boy. "Papa?" The sound wasn't loud, but it hit like a landslide. Samuel stood in the doorway, small and square-shouldered like he'd decided something in his bones. Evelyn froze, her breath held hostage by the impossible. Ezekiel looked from the boy to the woman, and something ancient and aching settled over him. He opened his arms without thinking, and the boy ran to him like he'd been waiting to all along. The word hung in the air between them. Papa. And Ezekiel let it wrap around his chest like armor. He looked up at Evelyn, who was staring as if witnessing a miracle. "He don't call just anyone that," he said, voice rough with meaning. Later, when the firelight painted the walls in soft amber and the cider steamed in their hands, He said it plain. "If you'd allow it, I want to marry you for real this time, not for land, not for law, but because I see you now." She looked down at the mug in her hand, then at him. Her eyes were wet but steady. "You're the first man," she said, "who never asked me to be less than what I am." Outside, the moon slid through the clouds like it, too, had been waiting for this night, and inside, beneath the quilt stitched from broken things, 3 souls began to feel whole. The wedding took place on a Saturday soft with wind. The prairie sky, cloudless and endless, bore silent witness as Evelyn stood in her second-hand dress, simple muslin, no lace, and Ezekiel wore his best flannel shirt, sleeves pressed, collar stiff with effort. There were no flowers but the wild lupines blooming stubbornly near the barn. No ring but the one Ezekiel had carved from cottonwood weeks prior, sanding it smooth by lamplight. And no music, save the hush of spring grass and the occasional call of a red-winged blackbird in the distance. They stood beside the garden fence, hand in hand, as the traveling preacher, sunburnt and reverent, read a few chosen verses. Samuel, in boots too big for him, held onto Evelyn's skirt and stared up at Ezekiel like the man had spun the whole day from nothing. When the final amen fell quiet, there were no cheers. Just a silence so full it felt like an embrace. One of the townswomen dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The same woman who once clucked about that Carter girl with no sense of place now pressed a warm biscuit into Evelyn's hand and whispered, "You look like the end of winter, child, in the best way." Later that week, the mayor cornered Ezekiel near the general store, holding the returned land deed like it burned his fingers. "You already had title," he said, baffled. "And you paid it off in cash?" Ezekiel didn't blink. "She was never the price," he said. "She was the gift." The words settled into the gossip lines of Dry Hollow like seeds in soft earth. And when the summer came, those words bloomed, just like the garden behind their cabin. Where once there had been only brittle dirt and wind-blown weeds, now thick tomato vines curled around twine poles. Squash fattened in rows, and sunflowers turned their golden faces skyward like they knew who they were growing for. Samuel's laughter rang out like music as he herded the calves barefoot through the pasture. His silence, once heavy as iron, had melted into joy that clung to everything he touched. He called Evelyn Mama now, not shyly, but proudly, as if reclaiming something the world had once tried to steal. One evening, Evelyn asked Ezekiel why he never spoke of the years before they met. He looked at her for a long while, then turned to the quilt folded at the foot of their bed. "Because the future you gave me," he said, voice steady as oak, "is all I need to remember." And so it was. They were not rich. They didn't travel. They never owned more than a few cows, a dog, and a boy with a fierce little heart. But they were whole. And in Dry Hollow, where once a woman had been traded for land, folks now told their daughters, "That's what love is, not loud, not perfect, just honest, and stitched from mercy."